for having me. Thank you for being here. This is really work that is pretty much, in progress. So I apologize in advance for not being able to give you a more polished talk. But on the other hand, this is of course a perfect venue to, try some new ideas and get great feedback. So I'm very excited to hear what you have to say about this. So here is a very quick outline of the talk. So in the first section, I'm going to talk about the so-called problem of change. And then I'm going to present in very summary fashion a new solution that has been proposed very recently by Martin Pickup, the so-called situationalist account of change. And then in the rest of the talk, in the remaining two sections, I want to raise certain issues about this account. About two core elements of this account, the one being situation-relativity that is involved in this account, and the other is the claim that any episode of ordinary change in ordinary objects giving rise to metaphysical indeterminacy. So I'm going to present an alternative way of understanding the unsettledness in such cases, in such situations in which things change in terms of non-uniformity instead of indeterminacy. But actually, this is the original agenda, but I'm going to skip this third section here because I'm worried that I might not have enough time to present everything. So I'm going to jump to section 4 after section 2, and if we have time, then we can talk about situation relativity afterwards or in the QA session. All right, so the problem of change actually is controversial that there's any such thing as the problem of change. Some philosophers think that there isn't anything that is worthy of that label, or it's also a matter of a dispute. Even among people who believe that there's a problem of change, what is that problem is supposed to be? So I'm not going to engage that debate to any extent. I'm going to just spell out what I take to be the problem of change. Actually, I don't really believe that there's such a thing as the problem of change, but rather different problems faced by different philosophers with different metaphysical backgrounds. So I'm going to describe why I consider to be a problem for atemporalists, and these are philosophers who endorse something like this thesis: all the facts that fundamentally constitute reality are visible from the atemporal perspective. They all make up the way reality atemporally. So in some sense, these atemporalists believe that the atemporal perspective upon reality is fundamental, right? So reality has a thoroughly atemporal nature, so to speak. That doesn't mean that it's timeless in the sense that it doesn't include time or instance of time. It may very well include that, and also material objects may be located at this or that times and have their properties at those times. But all these facts about how things are at times are really atemporally obtained facts. Right? There's no temporal sensitivity in the obtaining of those facts, or no temporal qualification involved in the obtaining of those facts. So. And this is very widespread, of course, in the metaphysics of time. Any classical B-theorist endorses something like this, but also people who don't really defend the classical B-theory may endorse this sort of view. So, okay, so let's look at a very simple episode of change. Here is Birdie. This is an exotic bird, and what makes it exotic is partly that it can instantly change its overall color. Right, so right now Birdie is blue all over, but then it turns green all over. Okay, why is it supposed to be? Is this supposed to, lead to a problem for the atemporalists? Well, once you adopt this atemporal perspective upon reality, then both of these incompatible qualitative states involving Birdie will be visible from that perspective, right? So it will be visible that Birdie is blue all over, and also visible that Birdie is green all over. And so given that these are incompatible states, we might hesitate to, admit them both into reality. But also, choosing one of these states at the expense of the other is not really much of an option, because that would be completely arbitrary, obviously, right? There's no justification for doing something like that. So the obvious solution, so to speak, is to introduce some sort of temporal qualification, right? So we don't talk of Birdie's being blue anymore, but rather Birdie's being blue at T1 and it's being blue at T2. But we should remember that we're still looking at reality from the temporal perspective. So what we are saying is basically that atemporally speaking, Birdie is blue at T1, atemporally speaking, Birdie is green at T2. So, and there's this initial tension, at least, between this atemporal, atemporalism, or the adoption of the atemporal perspective, and the need to introduce some sort of temporal qualification in order to accommodate mundane episodes of change, right? So, yeah, this is the tension, and I don't intend to say that there are no solutions to this problem, and the general strategy pursued by atemporalists has been to associate this temporal qualification with certain fact components. So the obtaining of these facts will be temporally unqualified. They will obtain atemporally, but the components of these facts will be understood in some temporal qualified way. And there are, standard, more particular versions of this sort of strategy. We can associate temporal qualification with the object, for instance, and talk of certain instantaneous objects like Birdie at T1 rather than Birdie being blue. Sorry. I don't know what happened. Okay, yeah. So, or we can associate a temporal qualification with the property, the apparently monadic property of being blue, and say that Birdie is not really blue, but rather blue at T1. Or perhaps we can also associate this temporal qualification with the instantiation link between the object and the property. Right. So this is all very familiar territory, obviously. So there are various different versions of these strategies. But the situationalist is supposed to be proposing an alternative way of making sense of this. And the key notion here is, unsurprisingly, the notion of situations, right? And Pickup defends a worldly conception of situations, right? Non-representational, worldly conception. So these things are supposed to be concrete portions of the world, chunks of the world. They're akin to states of affairs or facts. He actually, he does mention Armstrong's view of states of affairs, for instance, doesn't quite endorse it, but, because he wants to say little about that sort of thing, but, just think of Armstrongian states of affairs, so to speak. And these are really composed, perhaps in a non-classical mereological sense, of these entities having properties and standing in relations. Okay. And two features of these situations are really important in the account. First of all, they can enter into mereological relations, right? So they can be part situations. One situation can be part of another situation, larger situation. And the mereology here is really classical extensional mereology. So there's a unique fusion of any plurality of situations. And the second component is situation-relativity. So there is these situations are not just chunks of the world, but rather they're also standpoints, so to speak, in some sense, relative to which things are a certain way, right? And this is actually the only way how things can ever be in this account. So there is no such thing as situation absolute ways of reality. So what is the case of always relative to the situation? There is no such thing as truth simplicity. Okay. So this is roughly the accounts. And so what the situationalist now does is simply to put these different states, these incompatible states involving Birdie, into different situations. And situationalist claims, well, in S1 or relative to S1, Birdie is blue, and in S2 it's green. So this is basically what the claim is, and we can just formulate this with the aid of some sentential situational operator. I mean, just read this as in S1, Birdie is blue, and so on. Right. But now the question is, we know that these situations compose larger situations, right? So the diffusion of these two situations, a larger situation that, in some sense, is composed by not in some sense, in the classical-mereological sense, composed by these two things. So the question arises as to how things are relative to the larger situation that they compose. And one response would be to say, well, it's prima facie at least plausible. Well, anything that is the case in a given situation S will also be the case in any other situation that has the initial situation as part, right? So larger situations inherit everything, all the truths, so to speak, of their parts. And this is what Pickup calls monotonicity. And the basic problem with this is that in that case, I mean, if monotonicity holds, then in this larger situation, it will be the case that Birdie is blue and Birdie is green. So we have a situation in which both of these incompatible states obtain in some way. So we have, I mean, this seems to commit one to something like dialecticism, but there may be certain moves that one can make as to avoid true contradictions here. But if this is true, it will be at least the case that reality, the larger situations that are parts of reality, involve some really radical form of incoherence, right? Whether they give rise to true contradictions or not, this will be a fairly incoherentist picture of reality, so to speak. And the situationalist wants to avoid that, and instead claims that, it will be the case in S3, for instance, that Birdie is blue and Birdie is green, and given certain assumptions, we can derive certain contradictions. But the situationalist wants to avoid all that, and says instead that it is indeterminate in this larger situation what color Birdie has. So it's not the case, it's not determinately the case that Birdie is blue, and also certainly not the case that Birdie is blue. And similarly, it's not determinately the case that Birdie is green, and not the case that Birdie is green. So it's indeterminate what color Birdie has in this larger situation. So the larger situation, how things are in the larger situation looks really quite fuzzy, so to speak, right? It's not determinate what color Birdie really has. It's all fuzzy around the edges. Okay. So now I'm jumping to, I think I'm suddenly it doesn't work. Yeah. So yeah, now I jump to section 4, and I want to raise 3 issues about the metaphysical indeterminacy, the kind of metaphysical indeterminacy that is involved in this account. So one thing has to do with the scope of metaphysical indeterminacy. So you might be quite sympathetic to the idea that reality may be in certain respects indeterminate, with respect to certain quantum mechanical phenomena, for instance. Various people have explored views of that sort, or with respect to fission cases, for instance. So in all these extraordinary cases, it might make sense to understand what's going on in terms of metaphysical indeterminacy. But you might still be alarmed by the scope of metaphysical indeterminacy that this sort of thing entails. Because if this is true, then any situation that includes any kind of change in any object is at least partly indeterminate. Right? So, and the world at large, so to speak, involves a huge amount of indeterminacy. So this really posits sort of in metaphysical indeterminacy, indeterminacy in the world at a huge scope, so to speak, and that's something that should give us some hesitation about accepting this account, I think. Yeah, and the second point is it's also a bit unclear how something as as simple as composition operation should result in metaphysical indeterminacy. So you take two bits of the world which are completely determinate as to how Birdie is, and you put them together by means of this classical-mereological composition operation, and suddenly the output is something that is indeterminate. So, but why? I mean, how can something as innocent, so to speak, as composition can give rise to something that is can give rise to a change in character of these chunks of the world? So one is reminded of Parfit's memorable phrase, how can a double success be a failure? Right. So you have two indeterminate bits of world, and put them together, out comes an indeterminate chunk of the world. And the last point is about the inability of the situationalist or fuzzy situationalist to make nuanced judgments about various different ways in which different temporally extended compound situations can involve disagreement among parts, so to speak. So the problem is this. So in the original case, we have these two situations, and we put them together, and we have a situation S3 in which it is indeterminate what color Birdie has. Now imagine a different situation, a different fusion of a huge number of situations in which Birdie is blue, and just a single situation in which Birdie is green. Now you put them together, and the resulting situation, S4, let's call it, also said about reality the same thing as the original fusion S3. Right? It's indeterminate what color Birdie has. So, but this sort of compositional configuration that is really very different doesn't get registered at all in what this S4 is saying about reality. And obviously, the same case can be repeated by means of a huge number of green situations in which Birdie is green and so on. So the fuzzy situationalist says about any situation in which any change occurs, it passes the same verdict about any situation in which any change occurs. But ideally, we should be sensitive to these sorts of differences between the compositional natures of these compound sets. And I've already suggested that this actually, but it's not as if it's initially prima facie plausible to think that ordinary change in ordinary objects gives rise to indeterminacy. But the only motivation seems to be that this is really the lesser of two evils, right? So we want to avoid incoherence or dialecticism. So why not say, well, these situations don't involve two contradictions but rather indeterminacy? That seems to be the motivation. So what I want to suggest now is that this is a false dilemma. The choice between the incoherence picture and fuzzy situationalism is simply a false dilemma. There is a way of rejecting monotonicity, and also even accommodating this idea that dynamic situations, so situations that involve any kind of change, involve some kind of unsettledness without appealing to metaphysical indeterminacy. Okay, so I want to describe the alternative account I want to introduce this alternative account by means of an analogy. So suppose that there is a search committee. This is drawn from the recent personal experience, by the way. So you have a search committee, right? It has 4 members, and 2 of the members determinately favor one candidate, candidate A, and the other 2 determinately favor candidate B. So there's a, in this case, it seems quite clear. I mean, and assume that any member of the committee has a vote of equal weight, right? So it seems that in this sort of case, there is a sense in which it is indeterminate what the search committee is actually saying about the choice between the 2 candidates, right? So it's indeterminate which candidates favored by the search committee, although it is completely determinate which candidate is favored within the search committee, so to speak. So which member is favoring which candidate is completely determinate, but it's indeterminate what the search committee as a whole is saying about this. So you have a disagreement between parts, and this results in indeterminacy about what the whole says about the affair, so to speak. Now contrast this with a family of 4 who participate in presidential elections. So 2 members of the family vote for Trump, unfortunately, and 2 for Biden. Right? Unfortunately. Yeah, that's unfortunate too. You're right. Yeah, absolutely. So there's disagreement between the family members. There's splits in the family, right? But there's no question about what the family as a whole, which candidate the family as a whole really favors, because families are not kind of things that really can vote in this sense, right? So there's a question about how the family voted, but that's just a question about the distribution of the votes within the family, right? It's not a question about really what candidate is favored by the family itself. So there's a distinction between vying within the compounds and vying by the compounds. So in the first case, you have both of these things, so to speak, right? So if candidate is favored by both by the compound is supposed to be favored both by the compound search committee and also within the search committee. In the second case, you only have vying within the compound. Okay, let's go back to the original case. So the situationalist says, well, we have these 2 situations, put them together, and what you get is something like a Turner, right? It gets fuzzy. It's indeterminate what color Birdie has. But this actually assumes that S3 has the prerogative to say something about Birdie's color, right? So over and above how Birdie is in the situations that compose this situation S3, there's a question about how Birdie is relative to S3 itself, right? Not just within S3, so to speak, S3, but rather really in S3 or relative to S3. And this assumption can be rejected. So we can reject the assumption that things instantiate properties in temporally extended situations or at intervals, right? So I'm talking about non-distributional properties here. So nothing fancy. So just monadic color properties. And the idea is things never instantiate such properties at intervals, but rather always at times, right? Or in instantaneous situations. So what you get is not a Turner, but rather a pointillist picture like like this Sorage. So this is pointillism. Any situation in which an object instantiates a property is an instantaneous situation. But this doesn't quite mean, of course, that things aren't ever, anyway, qualitatively speaking, in these compound situations, in these extended situations. Rather, their qualitative profile in these temporal extended situations turns on how they are in those situations, in those instantaneous situations that compose that temporally extended situation. So what I want to do is to draw a distinction between two senses in which a situation can contain, intuitively speaking, a certain fact, right? So on the one hand, we have what we can call encasements. So a situation encases a fact if and only if in this situation it's the case that phi, right? So encases the fact that phi if and only in S or relative to S, phi. But there's also a different sense in which a situation can contain a fact, and this is what I call harboring. So a situation S harbors the fact that phi if and only if there is some situation S prime such that S prime is part of S and in S prime phi. So harboring is a matter of having as a part something that encases the relevant fact. So what follows from this is that temporally extended situations, E situations, do not encase but rather harbor qualitative facts, right? And whenever a fact is harbored by some situation, it is encased within that situation. So that situation involves some other situation that encases that fact. And therefore, there is a question about the distribution of the encasement of that fact within the larger harboring situation. And we can introduce certain operators to describe different ways in which this distribution of encasement can go. So we can, for instance, have an operator that tells us that it is pervasively the case. In a certain situation, it's pervasively the case that phi, which simply means that in all parts of that situation, phi is the case. Right? So all parts of that situation agree on its being the case that phi. And we can also have a different operator which tells us it is uniformly the case that phi, which means that there's some situation in which phi is the case that is part of this larger situation S, but also no situation in which it's not the case. So some parts of the larger situation may be silent on whether phi is the case or not, may not ask any verdict on that question, but no, there's no part of this larger situation which really disagrees with its being the case that part. It's uniform. So no, it may not be pervasive, but it's uniform. And finally, we can say that in some situations it is variably the case that phi, which means that there is some part in which phi is the case and a different part in which phi is not the case. So once we have these operators that allow us to make these different judgments about the distribution of the encasement of a fact within the harboring fact, we can now say that in atomic situations, so in situations that have no other no proper parts, that have no other situation as proper parts, everything is always pervasively the case. Because there is no disagreement among the parts, because there are no proper parts. And in instantaneous situations and static situations, which may be temporally extended, but these are situations in which no change occurs, nothing changes, right? Everything is uniformly the case. And in dynamic situations, in situations in which some object changed undergoes change, at least something is variable the case. So these temporally extended situations cannot really say the same things about reality in the same way as these instantaneous situations. They simply don't pass any verdict on things instantiating properties in this sense, right? But they do get to say, in a distributional guise, so to speak, everything that their components instantaneous situations. So there's a way of accommodating all these truths within these parts that are holding these parts without making them verdicts of the larger harboring situation, so to speak. Okay, so what this picture gives us is non-uniformity in dynamic situations rather than indeterminacy. So change makes the world less uniform and more variable, but not fuzzy to an extent. And this is exactly what we wanted to, what we should want to have, because I mean, it's unsurprising that change, qualitative change, makes the world non-uniform. You know, that's exactly what change does. And fuzziness is not really intuitive and also not really required to make sense of, you know, this unsettled. It's unsettled within a dynamic situation where the, for instance, in the original situation where the Birdie is blue, because it's only variably the case and non-uniformly the case that Birdie is blue. And also, this notion of non-uniformity is inherently compositional because it is defined in terms of composition, in terms of particles. So it's no mystery why the composition operation may give rise to non-uniformity, as opposed to it's being rather unclear why the composition operation should give rise to any indeterminacy, right? And also, this alternative pointillist account allows us to make really allows us to discriminate between different ways in which the parts of a larger situation may disagree on something's being the case. So we are free to introduce various further operators, distribution operators. For instance, we can say, well, in one situation it's predominantly the case that's phi, or overwhelmingly the case, or near uniformly the case. However, you may want to define these operators. You have the basic pattern of or basic distribution of this encasement within the harboring situation. So you can find various different ways of describing that, expressing that, the different sorts of patterns. So the pointillist situationalist doesn't have to pass the very same verdict about these different sort of patterns of encasement. So in this case, for instance, it's the case that it is variably in S3. It is variably the case that Birdie is blue, and also variably the case that Birdie is green. But in this case, for instance, we can say, in addition to it's being variably the case that Birdie is blue and variably the case that Birdie is green, that it is predominantly or even near uniformly the case that Birdie is, right? And in the other case, we can say, well, it's near uniformly the case that Birdie is green. Okay, so that actually is what I wanted to say in this fourth section. I want to go into the stuff in the third section because that will take far more time. So I can stop talking now.
Thank you, Bahadir. So we have like 25 minutes for questions. I see Ulrich Mehr. Please put your hands up. Yeah, Ulrich.
Okay, thank you very much. I was wondering whether that at the end of the day, looking back at what we did, it looks to me as if we just rediscovered something really very familiar. So it's atomic situations are like instants of time. Fusions of atomic situations are like time intervals. So the question is, what should we say about a claim being true in an extended time interval? And there are two options. It's true at every moment in the interval, or it is true at some point in the interval. And it seems to me that the way you set it up, with the fusions and the monotonicity requirement, is that you committed yourself to the view that a claim is true in a time interval, just in case it's true at one time. It is true at some time in the time interval. So in the case of the bird, yeah, it's true that in the time interval, it's true that the bird is blue. It's true that the bird is green. Plus, it's true that it rained yesterday. It's true that it was sunny yesterday. That's not a contradiction. That's how it ought to be. And then kind of at the end, we get the uniformity thing where you just reintroduce the other reading that's true at all times. Is that, so I don't see how we ever kind of get into a worry about dialethism, metaphysical incoherence, any of that stuff.
Well, it's, on this account, it's not at all true that relative to the larger situation, it's true that Birdie is blue. So it doesn't follow from the fact that that the larger situation involves has a part relative to which things are a certain way. It doesn't follow that things are that way relative to the larger situation.
Is that monotonicity?
That is the rejection of monotonicity.
Well, but I don't understand why you would ever want to reject. We have the fusion, and that's a straightforward way of understanding the monotonicity requirement, which is that a claim is true in an extended time interval, just in cases true in at least one time. Something is true at a fusion of situations, just in case it's true in at least one of the situations. And
going back to the slide with monotonicity. So if this is true, if monotonicity is true, then whatever is true in the smaller situation will also be true in the larger situation.
Yeah.
But then when you have a dynamic situation in which things instantiate incompatible properties, you have two incompatible facts in the larger situation.
Well, it's true that it rained yesterday. It's true that it was sunny yesterday. There's no contradiction there.
Yeah, because you relativize somehow.
No, I don't relativize at all. And this yesterday is a kind of extended situation. It's made up of kind of atomic situation. I got to tell the story. I got to tell exactly the same story that you told at the end.
Unless you tell a story about how these two incompatible states get to be true, get to obtain in the larger situation, in which case you will probably relativize them to different portions of yesterday with the interval that you call yesterday. This comes you to a contradiction, right? So if you really say without qualification, without explaining it in any further terms, that in this large station it's raining and also it's sunny, that's two. These are two incompatible states.
No, okay.
And then you will tell a story about how it gets to be, that way and so on. This is exactly what I'm doing, basically. And I'm saying that we don't have this choice between true contradictions and indeterminacy. There's a far more plausible, and also you say, as you rightly point out, unoriginal way of making sense of this sort of stuff.
Thank you.
Next on the list is Thomas Sadik.
Thanks. I find the criticism of really plausible. I just want to end your conclusion, really. And I just want to go back to the beginning, the setup of of what you criticize. So just the mereology.
Yeah.
So this is supposed to be an account of the problem of change, and then you have the situations which replace the moments.
Yeah.
So, but this is not about use, but yes. So what? Of course, change is there's always a temporal order. So the situations we're looking at, we don't get change by just relativizing situations. There need to be extra structure connecting them, and it needs to be ordered because otherwise it's not even resembling change. So what I'm asking is that what happens to the order when the plus sign appears? Because if it's mere fusion of the situations, then it's gone. But if it's a sensible way of combining situations that respects what they do, then the larger situation will be internally ordered.
Yeah.
But if it's internally ordered, then the monotonicity principle state is completely blind to that. So I wonder where that comes from, where that even relates to the setup, to the ontological setup of the situation. Can you tell me, because this is probably stuff you didn't talk about, can you just tell me?
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
guide me through that.
This was partly what I want to talk about in section 3. So, I mean, initially,
make it short.
Yeah. This is just I mean, there is a way of understanding all this as a just terminological variant of what's going on in in the literature, basically, right? So if you have, for instance, spatial maximal instantaneous situations, these will be your times, basically, right? So you can say everything that the classical B-theorist or atemporalist wants to say in this alternative terminology. So you have the same choices that you have. And the point I wanted to make is that the situationalist must understand situation relativity in a fairly radical way, right? So this is supposed to be really something that the B-theorists can't adopt in this way by turning by understanding times and moments of time in terms of spatial maximum instantaneous situations, and then that actually means that this is incompatible with atemporalism. That's one point I wanted to make. And also, it's also not very clear how the fundamental situation relativity is supposed to work in this account, because Pickup wants to say that some situations don't obtain and some obtain. So there are possible situations that don't obtain. And as far as I can see, whether or not a certain situation obtains is an absolute matter. But situations are also simply situations of things being a certain way, right? So it is absolute. So it's an absolute matter. It's a temporally absolute matter that the situation of Birdie's being blue obtains, for instance, but it's supposed to be situation relative that Birdie is blue. So there are various problems here in this account concerning the how this situation relative is supposed to be understood. Yeah, I didn't talk about that.
Jan Platten?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I was wondering, apart from why we are relativizing to situations of times, also why we're not, why we can't reject the idea that fusions of situations are also situations. Why are we in need of these extended situations?
Yeah, I mean, good question. I mean, one reason why one might want to, I mean, I don't like this, but you might want to include situation relativity, or you might prefer situation relativity rather than temporal relativity, more classical temporal relativity, because you want to have a semantics that is a bit more fine-grained about certain things. So this whole situation semantics business is, of course, there are these concerns about aboutness and so on. So if you just have these spatial and maximal instantaneous situations, times, some parts of that won't really say anything about certain things being the case. So you might want to have a more fine-grained way of talking about chunks of the world making certain propositions true. So that would be one reason why situation relativity might be a good idea, in general. About mereology, well, you probably would need some reason to reject that. The idea that certain chunks of the world don't really compose larger chunks of the world. Why would you reject the idea that? I mean, if you're not, a composition skeptic in general,
I can be okay with having lots of big fusions of all kinds of situations, but why call them situations? Basically, you can have fusions of hydrogen atoms, but those fusions aren't going to be hydrogen atoms.
So it's not really important what you call them, but it's important whether they have the same role in the account as small situations, and that's exactly what I'm saying. They don't have the same role, so they're not standpoints of relativization. They shouldn't be standpoints of relativization. So it's not the case that, I mean, you can have times and intervals, obviously, right? They compose intervals, but intervals are not the things at which things instantiate properties. Right? So intervals don't have the same function in the account, same role in the account, so same explanatory role in the account as instance of time. And this is exactly what I'm doing, basically.
Except I'm saying you could even go one step further and just deny those fusions the status of situations.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, of course. I mean, because if a situation is something that in which things are a certain way, in which things instantiate a property, if you define a situation in this way, then I'm saying that, right? So these are, whatever they are not situations. They are fusions of situations, but they are not situations because things don't instantiate properties in them. Exactly.
Sorry, don't lose your name. The next one.
Maybe my question has to do with the fact I'm not sure I understand what situations are. So let's say the problem seems to have been set up this way. You have some proposition P that in situation 1, not P adopts in situation 2. By not-unicity, take the fusion, you have situation 3, such that P obtains, and situation 3, which is P does not obtain. And now there's some other assumption, which is it obtains in situation S, P obtains situation S, and Q obtains situation S, then Q and P obtains situation S. And that's what I'm not sure why we would want to do this move. So in this bigger situation,
yeah,
P obtains, not P obtains, but why can we separately?
Yeah.
Why?
What do you mean by separately? So
maybe that has to do with the fact that I'm not sure why I get by what you mean by situation, but in situation 3, P obtains. In situation 3, not P obtains. And now there's a move to in situation 3, P and
so
not P obtains.
You're skeptical about the conjunction introduction. Yeah.
So is that a possibility to deny, or?
Yes, I mean, people have explored these sorts of views, obviously, but you know, so you're basically fragmenting the large situation, right? So you're saying that in this large situation, it's the case that P, also the case that not P, but it's not the case that P and not P.
Yeah, I would want to say.
Yeah. I mean, that's another possibility, but even in that case, there is a clear sense in which reality is deeply incoherent. I say, you know, even if you have a semantics in which prohibits conjunction interaction in this way, I mean, you can have that, and people have developed such views, obviously, but it's still true that reality, these large situations are deeply, deeply incoherent, right? And something is really, I mean, and the idea that really mundane change, really very, very ordinary stuff, should make reality so radically incoherent is not a very attractive one. So I agree with Pickup when he would say, well, that's nice, but it's still the case that these large situations are really incoherent, right? I mean, even if the conjunction is not true in them, it's still the case that in S3 P and in S3 not P. That's not really a consequence that I want to have just because I want to make sense of ordinary change in ordinary objects, right? So I'd agree with him that indeterminacy is a better alternative than this incoherentist picture. But again, this is just to say that it's the better of the lesser of two evils. So yeah.
Next, Martin Lippmann.
It's maybe related to your response to Thomas's question. Like one thing that I'm always a bit puzzled about with the situation is sort of, I don't get how it sort of does justice to the core motivation. There's a problem of change, and then we relativize somehow to get away from the issue. But now I relativize to something that we take to be a situation. Situation we think of as a large fact.
Absolutely.
And then if you make that fact very small, it just is the fact that Birdie is blue.
Exactly.
I mean, so now I get the statement that Birdie is blue relativized to this thing, which actually is the fact that Birdie is blue.
Yeah.
And now I've sort of somehow removed the issue, and I think it's just in the end not really solving the problem of change. I think this will apply to any situation, whatever you do with monotonicity, or because we shouldn't relativize to situations.
Yeah. And also that the situation is really there. That the world includes that situation is an absolute matter as far as I can see. So there is no relativity involved in the obtaining of the situation. So it's there. Yeah. And we're just saying that relative to that, which itself obtains, absolutely speaking, right? Something is this way and so on. So
yeah, so I'm a bit confused because you seem to agree with this.
Yeah.
So but then why is it still chapter 4? So why do you still are interested in sort of taking these larger things and sticking with the relativization and doing the harboring, and because it seems to be that it just sort of falls short at slide at sort of chapter 2.
Yeah, I see. But the idea was to, even if there is a way of, circumventing this problem, and perhaps we can circumvent it by saying, well, forget situation relativity for a moment. We have just classical temporal relativity. So at T1, things like circumvent and so on. But then introduce situation relativity within the temporally relativized world, so to speak. So within T1, so things are circumvented at T1 or relative to T1, and then you have also situation relativity for making certain fine-grained judgments about certain truths.
But the at T does all the work then.
Sorry?
The at T relativization does all the work, and the added situations don't do much.
Yeah, I mean, but you relativize the obtaining of the situation itself 2 times. So it may be, you may have a view in which what situations obtained at all itself is relative to certain types. And then you might still want to have some sort of situational relativity because you want to say, well, not the whole reality makes through this proposition, but rather some smaller part of it. So you're talking about smaller chunks of the world, so to speak, by introducing this situational relativity. But this is all relativized fundamentally to types. And there may be variation in what situation obtained from time to time.
So then I don't see where there's room for mereology, because if you get Birdie as blue at one time and we get Birdie as green at a different time, it's never a time when you get both of these. Then it seems we never get a fusion.
Yeah.
Because we have this one part, not the other part, the other part, not the first part. So why would we ever have this fusion? So why would
sure. Yeah, so there will be no change in that sense within the relativized, temporally relativized realities. Right, you're right. Yeah.
Martin, what's that's my list? Did I forget something? Oh yeah, I'm sorry.
In your first slide, you had various sentences where you applied the time first to the predicate, then the singular term, and then something else.
In the first slide.
Yes. So there is blue.
It's not take some time. Sorry.
No. Yes.
So you mean this probably? Yeah, this one.
Yeah,
right?
that you attach the time to Birdie blue, so to the predicate and the singular term. And I wondered, wouldn't it fit your account best if you applied the time to the whole proposition, so that one proposition obtains at one time?
Well, this is basically what this move of taking situation relativity or temporal relativity as fundamental basically amounts to. Right? So these are atemporalist ways of making sense of temporal qualification. So within the constraints of atemporalism, even if you think that reality is thoroughly atemporal in nature, you can make sense of temporal qualification by qualifying the components, so to speak, right? So you turn one of the properties into, well, relations to times, for instance, or you think of the things that instantiate that are supposed to instantiate these properties in as these instantaneous things whose identity depends on the single time at which they exist, and so on. So these are all atemporalist ways of making sense of temporal qualification within within the constraints of this.
Okay, so that's nothing you do, and
No.
proposition.
That's not what I'm doing, and also that's not what pickup intends to do. So his account is supposed to be an alternative to all these.
Okay, thank you. Let's thank our leader.
Okay.